Hello, and welcome to Mystery Watchability, a podcast about movies, awards, actors, and the many blessings and curses that they give us. A very special guest is joining me on the pod today. She has written for Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, TCM, and MTV. She was the film editor at The Wrap and the TV editor at IndieWire. She's written 2 incredible books, with a third on the way, has been featured in the Criterion Collection, hosted multiple Q&As. She hosts and produces the film podcast Ticklish Business. She's attended many Hollywood events and mingled with stars, directors, and crew members. And she is here to speak about her book, Popcorn Disabilities, The Highs and Lows of Disabled Representation in the Movies. Kristen Lopez, welcome to the pod.
Wanting to chat with me. I appreciate it.
I had read, but have you read the book? I'm like, yeah, I really like this. And then I followed you on Instagram and whatnot, and I saw you had a new one coming out, and I'm like, this is a fascinating topic, and I
Yay.
need to read the book. So I messaged you. I'm like, I don't know what she's gonna say. She's a busy woman. I don't know. And then you're like, yeah, and I'm like, oh gosh.
Exactly. Yeah. All good. Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the pod again.
Of course.
Highly nervous. I've never interviewed anyone as big as you before, so
I'm very, very bland.
I don't believe that. But anyway, uh, before I begin every interview and whatnot, I always ask, what made you fall in love with movies?
Oh gosh. I mean my household, we've always been big movie people, so my parents would go to the movies all the time. We'd go to the drive-in a lot. Movies have always just been a thing with me. And some of the earliest ones that remember just seeing, like, Disney was big in my life. The Wizard of Oz. And at a certain point, I started reading about movies and kind of took it beyond just like the films themselves. I wanted to know about the filmmakers, and I wanted to know about the stars. And I was fortunate to take film classes in high school when, electives were still actually fun. So yeah, movies have always just been a huge part of my life. They were there from, I'd like to say, from minute one.
Now, that's a great answer. Everyone seems to have that answer of just somehow they watch something, they're like, oh, I want to see how this is made. And then once you're in, you can't get out. It's
Exactly, yeah.
such a big problem. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the book. I
Sure.
tried to word it in the best way
Oh,
possible, try not to offend or anything like
oh,
that.
no,
I'm
no.
very cautious about that. Uh, so, what inspired you to write Popcorn Disabilities?
I got told I should write another book. No, I mean, I'd finished my TCM book, and I didn't think that I was gonna write anything else. I figured, like, I just didn't have anything. And my book agent was like, "Well, you should, try to come up with an original idea," because the first book was not something I originally had pitched. It was something TCM had pitched to me. And so I had a couple ideas that I'd sent out that didn't really go anywhere. I had a full-time job at that point, so I was like, if I'm gonna do this, I don't really have a ton of time to devote to research, even though there is a lot of research in the book I ended up writing. I was like, what do I know well enough? Writing 101, write what you know. What do I know? And I was like, well, I don't think there's ever been a book about disability in the movies told from my perspective, and talking about how it affects a generation of film viewers, specifically how it has affected me. So, I kind of conjured up this really, like, kind of half-written pitch, and we sent it out, and the publisher was a little apprehensive, and then we did a Zoom call, and I kind of laid out how I wanted to, go about it, and he was like, "Okay, that makes more sense than what you'd written out." And so yeah, they wanted to do it, and I was like, "Oh crap, now I actually have to write the thing." And I figured worst case scenario, it would be an opportunity to take all the years that I had been writing about disability in film, the terminologies that I had come up with, the tropes, and have them all in one space, so I can kind of point to that and be like, all of my disability writing is in one book.
That's a great answer. And I hope your writing proves itself in the future for many people because
Fingers crossed.
it's it's a great read.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it a lot. So why do you think it's a necessary read for cinephiles or those who want to educate themselves on disability representation in movies?
Yeah, I mean, disability in the movies, it's a relatively new-ish topic. It's still very much in its infancy. Ableism is still a relatively new ism in the grand scheme of things. So, I don't think that there's been enough discussion about the role entertainment has played in setting up kind of a world of what disability looks like and also keeping out disabled creatives. So I think that's a big, I hate to say like it's going to be the new frontier, but I really do think it is, people have the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of trying to up, the numbers of disability representation, good representation in film. I think the other thing is, sheer numbers. 1 in 4 in the US has a disability. Those numbers, unfortunately, are only going to go up because of long COVID and, people are living longer. Disability will affect everybody at some point in their life. And so I don't want people to be afraid of that. Unfortunately, I think movies have very much made people afraid of becoming disabled. And so, my hope is that reading this will kind of let them know like, oh, this is kind of a lie that we've been fed over, decades of what disability looks like. And a lot of it's not true. And a lot of it I think has negative impact for people who are able and people who are disabled. And at the same time, 3 and 4 don't have a disability. So we do need allies and we do need able people to care about this because unfortunately they are the ones, especially in Hollywood, that have the most power, that have the ability to do more. And so I really my hope is that everybody reads it, regardless of whether you're disabled or not, and look at the movies that they're watching a little bit closer and ask questions. Why are most disabled characters white men? Why are most disabled characters disabled later in life? All everything that is done in movies with regards to marginalized communities is deliberate because they believe that that is what the community is. So if you have bad representation, it's because you don't know enough about the community itself. So my hope is, just making more active viewers and maybe inspiring the next generation of, creatives, abled or disabled, to want to do the opposite of what a lot of these movies, not every movie, but a lot of these movies have kind of done.
I agree. The world mainly gets most of its information from either the news or the movies, really. And the more they negatively represent things, the more people are going to believe it to be true.
Yeah.
And I hate that so much.
Yeah, film is a global medium, and the culture influences the films and the films influence the culture, so they all work together. And even though film I don't think has the same impact as it did, 10, 20 years ago, it still has a huge impact. And I think one only has to look at the changes with regards to how people of color have been portrayed. Nowadays we know that certain things are offensive, when talking about, the African American community. And that is because people were calling it out and, black creatives were starting to tell their own stories. And I'd like to think that, that's something that's going to happen with disability, is that people are going to start noticing like, hey, actually a lot of this is really questionable, and what are we doing to kind of right those wrongs?
Yeah, I completely understand. That was one of my other questions. Why is Hollywood trying so hard to represent a majority of communities, but they're still abandoning the disabled community?
I think because they don't understand. Most people, unfortunately, when we talk about marginalized communities, there's still this real belief that disability is not a marginalized community, that it's not a personal identifier, that it is a medical condition. And that is very kind of, I think that's caused disability to be ignored amongst stuff like gender sexuality and race. Because it's this belief that, like, well, it doesn't define you, right? We've been told for years my disability doesn't define me. I always say that that is a very unnuanced opinion. Yes, I do not allow my disability to stop me from living my life, but it does define me. It is part of who I am just as much as me being a woman is who I am, and I think that that's something that we are not grappling with disability. So until we can include it amongst other marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community or, the BIPOC community, that's where it starts. And I think that right now, Hollywood is slowly starting to acknowledge disability needs to be part of these movies, but that's really it. It's just acknowledgement. We're not really engaging with it in the right ways, and I think a lot of that is twofold. It's the belief that the average audience doesn't wanna watch those types of movies. It's also the belief that, the only reason to tell have a disabled character is to tell a disabled story. That's not the case. You can include disability in a movie that has nothing whatsoever to do with the topic. And I think right now the other thing that they're afraid of is they don't want to offend, so they're just not touching the subject. They're like, "Well, we don't want to offend anybody, so we're just not even going to deal with it." And I always think that's very silly because that's like saying, "Well, we don't want to offend women, so we're not going to put any women in our movies." It's just I think it's short-sightedness on the part of studios, but I think it's also just a lot of preconceptions about where disability fits in the world, and that trickles down to the films.
I completely understand. Like, even when you said they don't wanna offend anybody, let's not touch it. To me, that feels even more offensive. Like
Yeah,
like, why
it
would
is.
you just ignore me?
Exactly, yeah, exactly, and I think that the issue, a great example of this very issue is that when I was working at a trade that I worked at, I really wanted to do an ongoing series interviewing actors who had portrayed disabled characters and talk to them about what they had learned, how they hoped to be better allies going forward. Even though they weren't disabled, what did they learn about disability playing these parts? What did they hope to continue with, that learning? How did they want to be better allies going forward? And I could not get anybody to talk to me. It was very limited. I think I got one or two people that were willing to, but most of their managers and agents said no, we're not going to do this. And I tried to explain to everybody, I'm like, I'm not interested in shaming anybody, I'm not interested in judging anybody. I just want to have a conversation about what they've learned, playing these roles. They played the character, you can't ignore that they did that. But I think there really is this belief in Hollywood that the disabled, the community, or really anybody interested in talking about the past is only interested in calling somebody to the carpet and pointing a finger at them and saying, "You hate disabled people." If we can't even have a conversation about, somebody playing a disabled character several years ago and how they would want to be better, I think that you look at kind of gotcha headlines about, people playing trans characters and, having to apologize. I think they believe that that's all the conversation is that they have to apologize for what they've done, and that's not what I'm interested in. And if we can't have that conversation because, you know, gatekeepers and celebrities are afraid of, having to get real, then the needle doesn't move forward. And I think that's a big issue is that there is really this fear that they're going to be chastised for doing this. Which, the sad fact is when reductive movies do come out, there is always pushback. And instead of coming at these things in good faith and acknowledging those things, they just choose to ignore it. And unfortunately, they can because there are not enough disabled journalists in the entertainment sphere. There's not enough disabled people with power in the industry to kind of say, like, no, actually, you shouldn't run from this. You should open and have a dialogue.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's it's an absolute shame, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
A and I hate that the managers and the agents rejected that idea because That's a fantastic idea. That's a great idea for a series.
Yeah.
I would read that.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't I lovingly kept telling everybody, I'm like, "I'm not interested, as a disabled person, I don't give a crap about, what role you played 30 years ago. I wanna know though, how do you look at disabled people going forward in your life? How did, being a wheelchair user inform how you look at access in the world that you live in? So many people end up caring about marginalized communities when they know them. And I would think that for an actor or filmmaker, portraying a disabled character would make them acknowledge the community. I think a great example, Sebastian Stan, when he did A Different Man, using his Golden Globes platform, when he won the Golden Globe to talk about how we need more stories. And I think that, he did a great job of acknowledging, that he didn't know a lot about disability. I was fortunate to get to ask him that very question, which is, how have you learned about disability in this process? And he was very candid about how he didn't know anything about being disabled, you know, before he embarked on the project. And now, he's learned about ableism that exists and microaggressions that exist with regards to disability. And, I definitely think that for, anybody that acknowledges that, the next goal needs to be kind of holding their feet to the fire and being like, cool, now how are you using your power and your allyship to advocate for more disabled representation?
I agree. I didn't get to finish A Different Man. I should have. I will come
I
back to
hope
it
you
again.
do.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
I mean, I I've become a small fan of or a big fan of Adam Pearson lately. Just
The best.
he seems like the sweetest guy.
He is.
Just
He is.
oh my gosh. But so you have a chapter about cripping for the Oscar, and I did see Coming Home. I watched that a couple of days ago, and it was incredible.
It's great.
It was a wonderful movie, and I haven't seen My Left Foot or Born on the 4th of July yet, but you point out the positives and the negatives in each of the performances. Why do you think the Oscars have such an obsession with able-bodied actors going method to play these parts?
I think it goes all the way back to the silent era. It goes back to Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney went through so many bizarre rituals and makeup techniques and all these things. He suffered for his art. And I think that that's what Oscar voters still really love, is the concept of suffering for your art. And also they love what disabled movies do, which is present this perseverance against the odds. Disabled people were the ultimate underdogs, and they love that. They love it. Especially if you are willing to go through a physical transformation where you suffer physically to pull it off. So Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot, John Hurd for The Elephant Man is another good one. The Elephant Man used a lot of similar language in how they would advertise his physical transformation, very similar to how they would describe Cheney in the 1920s. So they love that. They love it. Right now, there is a movie that is nominated for a Golden Globe, could very well be nominated for an Oscar, that has a disabled plotline that is very, very reductive, and disabled people have complained about it. And I've been asked before, why do you think people are, gravitate to it, and it's been nominated for an award? And I say the same thing. People love the concept of inspiration porn. They love the idea of watching somebody suffer through the horrors and indignities of being made disabled and coming out the other side a better, stronger person. It's even better if you're a hot girl and you're going through this and kind of like deglam a little bit, because Oscars also and awards bodies have a whole other side issue with rewarding women that deglam and, are just normal in their appearance. So yeah, that's why I think Kate Hudson got nominated for Song Sung Blue this year. But I think that that's it. I think that the awards bodies consider any type of extreme physical transformation and this idea of scaling up that wall of, personal uh, personal transformation and struggling against your own body betraying you. They love that, they eat that up. I mean, I don't think it's not a cure all. It's not as easy as saying if you play disabled you are guaranteed an Oscar. That I think the numbers actually lie a little bit. It is not a fail, it is not a de facto like it's going to happen, because we've seen actors that have done that and have not gotten recognition or have not won the Academy Award. And I think that it's because you have to play a very specific type of disabled. You can't, so if you are playing a disabled character that does not have an extreme physical transformation, it's a little bit harder for you to get the nom outright. If you're also playing a disabled character that is too nuanced, you have to struggle. There has to be struggle, there has to be trauma. It can't be too cutesy either, it's gotta definitely be like serious drama, usually not comedy. It can't have any type of like, you have to kind of be like the indignities. The indignities have to pile up. And you also can't make the audience uncomfortable. People joke about, the Tropic Thunder speech talking about how Sean Penn went home empty-handed. He still got nominated, but he did not win. And I think a large part of that is because people have a real, especially awards bodies, if you can pass for able, you have an easier time, with mental disabilities, they get uncomfortable. So it's easier to reward someone like Daniel Day-Lewis who goes through this extreme physical transformation, but his character is still intellectually has cognitive stability, than somebody like Sean Penn, whose character maybe has the physical tics, but makes the audience uncomfortable. It's a very specific, like, it's very deliberate. You can almost kind of tell what they're gonna gravitate towards, because of the past.
Yeah, Song Sung Blue had its good moments and it had its weaker moments. I was watching it, and when Kate Hudson's, when she gets her leg amputated and whatnot, I was thinking, "Oh gosh, what is Kristen gonna say?"
What's
Because
funny is people get really, I've been surprised by how many people, whether in good faith or not, have kind of yelled at me for not liking the movie, and I haven't really heard any of my colleagues talk about the ableist elements of that. It had been a minute since I had seen such a reductive, old-fashioned portrayal of disability, and when Kate Hudson is like having a dream sequence where she's on two legs, which, is a big thing that happens in a lot of these movies. While she's in this drugged out haze and she's like army crawling on the front lawn, drugged out on Percodan or whatever. I was just like, oh wow, it's been a minute since I've seen army crawling, because I thought we had gotten over the fact that that is not actually a thing disabled people do. But it's just it's funny. I have to laugh about it, but I also am very surprised when, people kind of jump on me and be like, "Well, it's not meant to be, for you." And I'm like, "Actually, I would argue that it is meant for me, because the belief is that disabled people want to watch movies about disabled people." So telling me that it's not made for me, you know, then who is it made for? Because I would assume that it's made for, like, maybe, a dozen Neil Diamond tribute band fans, like, it's a pretty niche topic.
oh yeah, I completely agree. Speaking of Oscars and wins, do you think you were talking about the Academy, like, feeling pity or having to see this, journey through disability. What about Troy Kotzer's win for Coda? That seems like a complete outlier compared to the others.
Yeah, Troy Kotsur and Paul Raci as
And
well
Paul
when he was
Raci, yeah.
nominated for Sound of Metal. I was really hoping, that both of them would. I want them to do more. And I think the fact that Troy Kotsur is, he's done a couple of very small projects since, you know, that's, I think, the big frustrating thing for me is that, yes, his character is so out of left field, compared to some of the other disabled winners, especially men, and I'm like, why is he not lining up projects left, right, and center? Why? Paul Raci is the same way. I mean, it was great to see him in something like, you know, what's the one with Coleman Domingo that
Sing
I
Sing?
Sing Sing, yes.
Yes.
I kept wanting to call it Song Sung Blue, and I'm like, "That's not what it's called." And yes, I mean, Paul Raci is a coda, he is a child of deaf adults, he is not deaf himself, but I think that for me, Troy Kotsur, I'm always frustrated that he did not jump out of the gate with, more movies. And I would say the same thing happened with someone like Marlee Matlin. She wins the Oscar for Children of a Lesser God, and she's been very vocal about how she struggled to continue that momentum and to keep getting, features. She's, found a very comfortable niche in television. But I feel that disabled actors, as we've seen historically, going all the way back to Harold Russell, in 1946 for Best Years, you know, Hollywood, because the movies are not about disability, they're like, well, we don't need you. We don't need you in this movie. It's not about disabled people. And I'm like, that's not what it's about. If you're only going to cast these people in movies about disability, then yeah, they're not ever going to make anything.
Like, I watched, Marlee Matlin's documentary, and she was
Yeah.
talking about that, and I was thinking, "Oh my gosh." Like, this woman reached the peak that all actors
Yeah.
want to reach, and then you guys were like, "Okay."
Yeah, they're like, "Well, you've done it. You can
Yeah,
go home
yeah,
now."
yeah, and I'm
I
like,
mean, you go back to 1946. Harold Russell won 2 Academy Awards for Best Years of Our Lives, and thought that he was going to have a huge career, and he went to William Wyler, his director, and said, "Let's work together. Let's do it." And William Wyler looked at him and said, "You should go to trade school. You should go do something else because the war is going to end and there's not going to be another need for a double amputee ever." And it wasn't until the 1980s that Harold Russell got a second film, when he was far too old to continue that momentum. And it's still happening. Yes, Marlee Matlin is continuing to act, Troy Kotzer is continuing to act, but these people are winning the apotheosis of what we say is, what every actor wants, and yet they're still struggling to have to make the argument that, "No, you should just put me in a role, period. It does not have to be a deaf performance. It should just be a character, and then we can figure out how to go from there."
in the documentary, didn't Aaron Sorkin mention that Marlee Matlin's character wasn't originally deaf,
Yeah.
and that she wanted it, and he was like, "Oh gosh, I don't know how to write for someone
Eh
like that."
yeah, and I think that it's a massive problem because yes, you get creatives that say, "I don't," like, they believe that the character has to be changed significantly in order to allow for that performance, which I think is BS. I think the other belief too, the stigma that is being, reiterated, is there is this real stigma that hiring a disabled person requires additional things. Marlee Matlin has talked about how, they wanted she, auditioned, I think, for, like, a show where she was gonna be a judge, and she wanted to use, an interpreter and, ASL because she has, an interpreter that speaks for her, and they were like, "No, you can speak, just talk." And she was like, "No, it's easier for me if I'm having to figure out, all this stuff, the performance is gonna suffer. Just let me, have an ASL interpreter and allow for somebody to speak for me." There very much is this belief that if you hire a wheelchair user, if you hire a deaf person, they're going to come with all this extra stuff, this extra baggage that's going to inflate the budget of your movie. And that's not true. It's not. And it's ridiculous that we are continuing to say that disabled people are too expensive to have in film.
Do you think that the new membership, like the members they introduced, like Adam Pearson just got in, Troy Koster's been in the academy, and so is Paul Raci. Do you think they'll have any kind of sway with their fellow members to be like, "Hey, this is not representative of our community?
Honestly, no.
Honestly, no.
I think that the problem is it goes beyond. I say that acting is the floor. Acting is the bare bones. If you can't get disabled actors in films, then you sure as hell are not going to get disabled screenwriters, directors, cinematographers. I think that the biggest issue right now is in the way that films are being made right now, which people do not understand how films are getting made today. You are essentially, if you are a producer trying to produce a movie, you have to have everything packaged. So you need to have a script, a director, and usually 2 or 3 stars already attached. And then you go to a studio and say, "I wanna make this movie. I already got this director attached, and these actors are gonna do it." And if all of those things are not big A-list names, the movie does not get made. Unless you are indie and you're, getting special financing and getting people to put in money. So right now, it's really we really need allies. We really need A-listers to want to advocate for us. If Steven Spielberg wanted to make Disclosure Day and was like, I want a disabled actor. I found this disabled actor. I want to put them in Emily Blunt's role. And I'm going to do that. Steven Spielberg's gonna have a hell of a easier time getting that movie made with that actor than me, than Adam Pearson advocating, with somebody like, "I want to make this movie." You know, we do need the allies, and more importantly, we need disabled people in the C-suites at the studios because they can greenlight. They can say, "We wanna do more with disability." We need more disabled we need more directors saying, like, "I wanna tell this story, but I don't know anything about disability, so I'm gonna hire a disabled screenwriter to write them." We need able people to take more initiative and to give a crap about this as well, because there's only so much the disabled community, because we are outnumbered, because we don't have the cachet in Hollywood. There's no disabled A-list pipeline because no one's creating it, because no directors and screenwriters are giving disabled actors the opportunity to lead these movies. So it's really systemic. It's really systemic, and it really does require able people to kind of step up and say, "We want to be a part of this."
That makes a lot of sense, and it's sad that that has to be that way.
It's gotta be all of us. I think that's the thing. I love the nothing about us without us mentality, and that is true. That is how it should be. But I think also we need to talk about the fact that it needs to be everybody participating, regardless of ability. And we need able people to say, "I'm gonna be a part of the solution. I wanna help."
I watched the, documentary Cinemability, and the Farrelly brothers said that they make efforts to include disability representation in their films. Do you believe that aligns with what they say, or do you
You
have
know,
some no's?
the Fairleys are interesting. The Fairleys are very interesting because I do think that they certainly try more, I think, than the average person, but the bar is low. The bar is very, very low. I talk about in the book, there's something about Mary, which, is still a movie that I love in the fact that it sells the storyline about, one of the guys that loves Cameron Diaz's character is a crutch user and claims he has cerebral palsy. There's a lot of jokes about watching him struggle to pick stuff up. It's very over the top. And then you find out, spoiler alert, that the character's faking it in order to gain sympathy. And I love that. The character is not making fun of disabled people. He's imitating what he thinks disability is in order to exploit it for his own able-bodied white guy ways. I love that. Something like Champions, which is another, fairly produced feature, does have, authentic casting. But again, I think that it's really easy to cast and say, "Well, we did it. We did the thing. We did it." So I would really push the Fairleys at this point to be like, "Well, right, but are you working with disabled screenwriters? Are you working with how many disabled people work behind the scenes on your projects? How much money have you given to disabled creatives to make their own projects? Have you produced? Are you working as producers and trying to get disabled filmmakers opportunities? I think that would be the thing that if I were in a room with them, I'd be like, "Look, it's great that you guys kind of are casting and you've talked about how disabled people don't need to be saints, they can be, assholes. That's real great. But like it shouldn't be all you're doing. You could be doing a lot more."
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if like if we care about inclusion so much, we're really doing a poor job of that.
Yeah, and honestly, I would question whether we care about inclusion.
Yeah,
The sad realities, here in the US is we have a president that says that DEI is done. Nobody wants that. Nobody cares about that. And I do think that eventually that is going to start trickling into the films. It already kind of is. Annenberg put out their most recent study and have said that a lot of all of the, marginalized communities have either stagnated or gone down since, over the last year. And I think that's only gonna intensify. I do think we're gonna start seeing less disabled people on screen, but we're also gonna start seeing a lot less people of color, I think, on screen, a lot less women on screen, a lot less women filmmakers, because there is this belief that the majority of Americans don't want that.
it's a sad state that we're in.
It's depressing as
It is
hell.
it's terrible. I hate it so much. Another chapter of your book you entitled War and the Bitter Cripple, where you talk about military films that prominently feature disability. And the common theme that keeps showing up is the lonely, sexless, angry, and bitter veteran.
Yeah.
Like, why are we still doing that?
I mean, we're doing that with men and women. There's just not a lot of disabled sex, period, in film. And I think part of that is I was just talking about this today. One of my friends, Nina Metz, wrote an article about the decrease in glasses wearers in film, and TV, and that there's not a lot of people that wear glasses anymore. And I keep saying Hollywood is about aesthetics. They have always been about aesthetics, and they are really doubling down on that. And for them, I think that the unfortunate fact is that they say disability is not sexy. Nobody wants to, it's like obese people. Their whole thing is like, well, nobody wants to see those two people, or one person having sex. I think of Don Mancini when I interviewed him about his Chucky films. He talked about how, when he screened one of them, there's a sequence where Fiona Dorff has sex with a man in her wheelchair, and he said that the executives, who were predominantly female, asked him to cut it because they were like, "We don't wanna see that." And he was like, "Are you offended at watching a disabled woman have sex?" And they were like, "Yeah, but, like, why is she having sex in the wheelchair? Like, why does that have to be a part of it?" And he's like, "Why does that not have to be a part of it?" Um so I think it's, the age-old belief that there's nothing beautiful, there's nothing sexy about disability, and yet, you watch that sex scene in Coming Home, and it's incredibly sensual and erotically charged, and I think the unfortunate fact is because there are not enough movies about sexuality with the disabled, the belief is that we're all just sad virgins, like, that nobody wants to have sex with any of, and I think that that's a double-edged sword. So you see something like Me Before You, where Sam Claflin's character quite literally tells Amelia Clark's character that, he doesn't wanna have sex with her because, like, he can't, and I was like, "Dude, you can. You can, you just don't want to, because I'm thinking that says a lot about your skills in the bedroom than anything else, okay?" But I think at the same time, if you're a woman and you look at how sex is portrayed with disability, it's often fetishization or sexual violence. And, that's also another problem. So, when we are seeing sex on screen, it is usually a fear of assault. And that's also just reiterating the fact that, like, well, the only person that would wanna have sex with a disabled woman is a predator. So there's a lot of really disgusting stigmas, I think, that go into this lack of sexuality, and it all boils down to the belief that there's nothing hot about that. Nobody wants to see that. And I always say, like, no, like everybody should be having more sex on screen. We know that Gen Z is not really into sex scenes. I think if Sinners and Heated Rivalry have shown us anything, everybody should be having sex. We want to see more of it, and it should definitely include disabled people.
I mean, yeah, fair point. When I was watching Coming Home, there's the black veteran that Jane Fonda is wheeling to the
Yeah,
hospital. He's like, "How do I live? How do I
yeah,
work? How do I have sex? How do I pay my bill?"
yeah.
He was asking all these questions, and she didn't know how to answer it because she's an
No,
able-bodied woman who just got threw herself into that situation, and I'm just thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is the
and people
'70s."
forget. People forget. Where do most teenagers learn about sex? And entertainment, whether that's pornography or whether that's just film, regular film. You learn a lot about being a person through movies, right? People can say all they want, well, you shouldn't be looking at the movies for things like that. That's irrelevant. People do, and that is what is going on. And if you're a disabled teenager who is watching these movies, yeah, you're going to be depressed because it's pretty much saying that your life is going to be sad, lonely. If you're a girl, you're not even seen, let alone going through the rites of passage that your able bodied peers are going through, and that your life is usually going to end short and in pain. So I really do worry about the current generation and the next generation of disabled children and teenagers who are watching these movies, or even worse, going on social media, and what are they learning? What are they learning about themselves and their own sexuality and their own desires for, finding love and romance? I talk about it in the book. I remember being told, in high school about a guy that was sexually harassing me, being told, like, well, he likes you. He doesn't understand. And the implication I got from those conversations was I should be grateful that this guy was choosing to ignore my disability, and that is what the type of love that I should be willing to accept. And I don't think movies and society is changing that for young disabled people. I don't.
Everyone thinks that, you know, everyone's euphoria hot,
Yeah.
and that's not true. That's not true.
If
Ev
Sam Levinson wants to put a disabled person in Euphoria, I would be all for it. And I mean, let's also talk about the fact that when disabled people do show up in film, it's a very specific type of presentation. I know Sex Lives of College Girls is one that I get talked asked about a lot. Lolo Spencer is beautiful. We need more Black disabled women in film and television. I love her. I love Ali Stroker. I love all of these disabled women that do exist. But I often say they are a very specific type of disabled, and as much as they're doing the work, they are aesthetically conventionally attractive. They are proportionate. They are able to, if they left their wheelchairs to the untrained eye, probably would pass for able, if that's what they wanted to do. Me, I am very short, I'm very compact. Because of my disability, I can't pass for able. I can't hide my disability if I get out of my chair. And there are a lot of disabled people that are in that same boat. And so when they're watching disability in film, even if that character is actually played by a disabled person, Marissa Bodie in Wicked, I don't, most disabled people are going to be like, well, yeah, she's beautiful. I don't look like that. I can't pass. And because I don't see anybody that doesn't pass, then that must mean that I'm not beautiful and that I can't make these movies, and I still think Hollywood puts them in a really crappy position because it undermines their success because it's the only view of disability that we deign to get.
Yeah, it's such such tricky. it's this I can't even verbalize it. I don't know how I feel like
Most
I'm gonna
people
word it
don't know the
wrong.
nuance. I think what
Yes,
you're pointing at is that there's nuance and there's complexity to it that most creatives are not even aware of. I remember talking about a movie that came out a couple years ago, and I won't say what it is. But I talked about how it was ableist, and I got a phone call from one of the representatives for the movie saying asking me why I said that it was ableist. And I explained, the ending of the movie situating that in the afterlife, that disability was eradicated and that their lives were better. I'm all, that's a problem. And the rep was very kind and she was like, "Well, I think if you talk to the director, he would say that, it was about that the location that they're in, which is their childhood home, was where they were happy." And I'm like, "Right." But I would argue that we're emphasizing that all of this happiness comes through death. We're saying that a character that has lost a limb gets that limb back by dying. A character that has been unfortunately had a traumatic brain injury is now neurotypically returned, quote unquote, to normal. I'm all, and the unfortunate thing is that if the director had known about the history of disability and how often that is presented, that death is presented as this great cure. It's what we all want as disabled people. We all want to go to the pearly gates because that's where we're going to be happiest. Well, if he had known that, I don't think he would have done what he did. So, and it was, I don't know if it was a fruitful conversation for the representative, but I was like, that's the problem. Is that creatives don't understand the tropes. And so they fall into very obvious traps and then they're like, "Well, I don't understand." Exactly. You don't understand. And if you had done some research, you might have known.
I completely agree. I mean, everyone in their life is going to die eventually, but it's like saying, "You're disabled, you wanna die."
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, "No."
That's the sad reality is that that has real consequences. There have been cases where caregivers have made the decision to murder disabled people under this belief that they are being set free. And that's a reality. I'm anybody that meets me knows that I talk to my therapist all the time about how often I think about death and I'm like I would like to avoid it as much as I can because I do not want it. And I think a lot, not most disabled people, they're not suicidal. They don't want to die, but unfortunately, movies have situated this idea that most disabled people are sad and they're lonely and they are just waiting for death to take them. And all of that sells this idea to abled people. Able people specifically that, this is what your life is going to look like. So never ever become disabled because this is what it is. When Million Dollar Baby came out, I didn't see it when it came out. I saw it a couple years after that, and I was just like, I was shocked because I was like, "Well, no shit does Hilary Swank wanna die." The movie pretty much says her life is absolutely horrific. The camera shows the hospital as this stark, frightening, cold place. Her family is, like, shoving a pen in her mouth trying to get her to sign away all her worldly goods. Um, you know, Clint Eastwood is selling this idea that there is no life once you're disabled. And I would argue to him now, as somebody a man who is in his 90s, like I don't see you being sitting there being like, "Well, am I just counting the hours, waiting until I'm set free, and I look young and spry again." Like, no, no. So I don't think directors and screenwriters understand when they talk about disability. They're always very surprised when I bring up disabled topics because I don't think they expect anybody to question it.
Yeah, I agree. And, like, even in your War and the Bitter Crippled, like, everyone that comes back from war disabled, they're just automatically like, it's over.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
mean,
they have no will to live. But, yes, there is PTSD that comes from being a veteran. My grandpa
yeah.
was a veteran. I totally understand that. But there's also like, he didn't just wanna die.
No, I mean, and if you look at, the war films specifically, World War II veterans, the movies were overtly positive. They were pretty much saying you should hire disabled people. You should do all this. These men are coming home. We owe them to give them work, And so you watch Homer Parrish in Best Years of Our Lives as he's navigating the personal elements of trying to get back into an established relationship with a woman, after he's lost his hands. You look at something like Pride of the Marines, which is based on a true story. A lot of these movies often had communities of disabled people. We're all in this together type of thing. The Band of Brothers goes off the battlefield into the hospital setting. And some of those attempts to kind of like say, well, your disability doesn't make you special is kind of hilarious. In Pride of the Marines, one of the friends tells, John Garfield's character, like, I understand exactly what you're going through. I'm Jewish. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure anti-Semitism and ableism are very different things, sir, but oh, thank you for trying. It wasn't really coming home really did change the game. Because it was Hal Ashby was working and Jane Fonda, who was a producer, they were working with disabled veterans, working with disabled organizations. They wanted federal government support, and the government was like, "You're talking about how we let disabled people down. We're not doing that." And Ashby very much was committed to showing what disabled men were going through, which is that, like you mentioned earlier, they're nobody tells them how to deal with ableism in the job market. Nobody tells them about navigating how to make money, as a disabled person when you're already struggling against discrimination. And yet, Luke Martin, the John Voight character, is very much a character that we should be celebrating. He has a car, he has a house, he's kind of a douche, yeah, but like that has nothing to do with his disability. Um, and you see him navigate all of these spaces that are inhospitable to him, and doing it well and succeeding and finding his own place. And his struggles to acclimate to society is not him acclimating as a disabled man, but as a man, period, with a disability. Those are two separate things. And I think that's amazing. When they tried to do when they tried to remake Best Years in 2006 with Home of the Brave, they knew that they had to acknowledge mental disabilities and PTSD, which they do, but they really do botch the physical disabled part. Jessica Biel, which I was really excited about. I'm like, women in war, we should be talking about disabled women in war. She comes back, she's missing an arm, and the movie is just so reductive in like, who is going to love this ugly woman who still looks like Jessica Biel, by the way, who is missing one arm. She's missing one arm. And you watch her go through, there's slow-mo flashbacks to her like playing volleyball and doing all these things with this one arm. You would think that the arm was like a friend she lost in Nam, like it takes on this like whole persona. And the whole movie is about how will she get a man to love her because she doesn't have an arm. And I'm like, so we still haven't done anything. We still haven't changed any of the tropes. I was waiting. The movie is so reductive and it's 2006. So we're like very much in the post 9/11 propaganda period. But the slow-mo of her like losing the arm is played with all the seriousness of like watching somebody like watching an insurgent kill her best friend. Okay? Like it's just it's ridiculous.
Oh my gosh, I mean, it's Jessica Biel, like,
Yeah,
I
yeah, I
mean,
was like, I'm
there's
pretty sure there'd be a lot of people that would still wanna have sex with Jessica Biel even if she doesn't have one arm. If she didn't have either arm, it probably would still be fine. But I mean, Hollywood, man.
I know. Yeah, and, like, when you were talking about coming home, and you'd mentioned this earlier, like, there being a fetishization of disabled people, like, when John Voight Luke is over at Jane Fonda's house for dinner, "Is this having a Gimp for dinner over for dinner?" And she's like, "No, no, no." bringing that up to her, like, "Hey, there are people who think this is some sort of fetish," and you're like, "Is this what you're doing?" And she's has to clear that up very quickly, and, I mean, I'm pretty sure audiences weren't even aware of that in the '70s, that
No, no, and I think that, now it's something that I don't think we're aware of happens even now, and it predominantly happens to women. You go all the way back to something like Charlie Chaplin in City Lights, and, disability often went hand in hand with women with their appearance. So, a blind young girl is presented as this angelic angel, that has no personality and is just good-hearted. She's so good-hearted, and, you watch Charlie Chaplin's character attempt to get her interest in him, and I'm like, just, "It sounds like you might be fetishizing her because she's blind and she's not gonna judge you because 'cause you're a homeless man," like, that's kind of the vibe I get here, and I don't really think we've ever reconciled with that belief. I think when Guillermo del Toro did Shape of Water, he was the first filmmaker, I think, to really showcase what fetishizing disabled women looks like and the harassment that comes from that. I tell people all the time, Shape of Water, I know everybody got all up in arms over the fish screwing element of it, but it really is a disabled horror movie. And it's not, and I don't mean that as a horror movie about disability. I mean, a horror movie for disabled people to watch and understand, because I show that to all sorts of people, and the minute they watch it, and if they're disabled, they're like, I understand this. This is reality. So, I don't think we do enough in talking about the fetishizing. We did in the silent era. You watch something like The Man That Laughs with Conrad Veidt, and his character in that movie has a big Glasgow smile carved into his face. And there's a whole subplot where the wealthy woman is really turned on by the fact that he's got this big grin, on his face. And I was like, wow, we're doing a lot to talk about fetishizing disability in 20, than we have in 2025.
I've seen The Shape of Water. It's a beautiful movie, but it's Michael Shannon's character is a monster in
He's
that film. He is
he's haunting, and I think the funny thing is people got really wrapped up in again, the fish part, but also the Sally Hawkins masturbating thing. They were like, "What is this? I don't like this." That they completely overlooked, I think the realities of watching Michael Shannon's character, and I talk about this in the book. The most haunting phrase in that movie is him telling her, "I don't mind that you can't talk." And that, I mean, it's bone chilling
that's
because
disgusting.
yeah, it's bone chilling because he is acknowledging the fetishizing, and that he also is acknowledging that he likes that she's a victim. He likes that he has control, and that and also I think the thing too is the fact that he's pretty much telling her, like, I'm not going to not assault you because you're disabled. If anything, I'm going to definitely do it. And I think that's why horror has always been one of the best genres for disabled stories. Something like Mike Flanagan's Hush is another good example of kind of utilizing disability and gender in horror. The John Gallagher Jr. character who plays the villain, who is known just exclusively as the man throughout the whole movie, you know, picks the Kate Siegel character as a victim because he thinks that, she's deaf. She's easy pickings, and a lot of his manipulation and harassment of her is the misogyny that comes from believing that he can do that because she's a disabled woman.
We as a country, we have so many problems.
We do. We very much do. Yes.
But uh, I can't even verbalize it. It's just disgust. That's all I can say. Just
Yeah.
with,
Yep.
I don't know why we have to be that way, but we are.
You
So
know?
yeah, but for fans of the horror genre, you have a chapter about disability and representation in horror, and you talk about Franklin in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as being the worst disabled character on screen ever. That's the boldest statement I've ever heard.
Well, but I come around to it in the book,
Yeah, you
I
do.
I said that, I put it out on social media and said that I thought he was the worst, and I thought what I was really surprised by was how many people tried to rationalize and explain that he wasn't. And it really did force me to kind of look at my own preconceptions and, kind of be like, have I been saying he's the worst character? Or actually, everybody else is pretty horrible to him, And also, if they have been infantilizing him all this time, of course he's going to act that way because he's never been forced into situations where he has to be independent. So, really, I went through a journey with that. And I think too, he's contrasted with Leatherface, who, according to the research I did, was originally given far more of a backstory about actually being a disabled person. So I think the fact that you have a movie where two characters are one is coded as disabled, one is overtly disabled, and Leatherface is a villain, yes, but one also has to look at his family as well, who treat him badly and have forced him into these circumstances. So, I at the end of the whole thing, I was like, have I completely misjudged this movie? I can't, I went through a journey. I went through a real change of thought process there.
I mean, I agreed with your statement probably because I've seen the film once and it stressed me out so badly that I haven't seen it since. I'm like, I can't.
It's a lot. It takes all kinds.
It is an intense film, and people are like, "Oh, it's not even that bloody." I'm like, "Guys, you just don't understand." Like,
And I mean, I think too, horror is interesting, especially the slasher genres, because you could argue that most of the big slashers are coded as disabled. Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, we know was definitely, is pretty explicitly disabled. Michael Myers, maybe we don't know. I think the fact that he's not. That we see the beginning of Halloween where he's unmasked as a little boy and he doesn't look disabled. I think that that's telling that he is different from some of the other more coded characters. But as we get into the late 1980s and the ADA slowly starts to wend its way towards being passed, and there is more of an acknowledgement that the disabled community is a community, horror really responds to that. And you get, Mark in Friday the 13th Part 2. There's a disabled character in Friday the 13th Dream Warriors. His disability might be psychosomatic, we're not really clear on that, but he's a wheelchair user, um, and I think all of that was a response to, like, we need to have disabled people reflecting this new world, and Mark in Friday the 13th, I know Don Mancini has talked about using him as a inspiration for the character of Nika in his latter 2 Child's Play movies, because he's just a guy. He's just a good-looking guy who wants to get laid like everybody else and ends up at Crystal Lake. I think if anything, I feel the worst for Mark because he does not get to engage in all the horny shenanigans that everybody else does, and he also gets the most just unnecessarily over the top death. For people that have not seen the movie, and it's a slasher film, all these characters are gonna die, so it's not really a spoiler. But the hilarity comes from he gets macheted to the face or something, and him and his wheelchair go out the front door of the cabin, and the cabin has stairs, which we already knew. And he goes down those, which honestly I thought that would be the end of it because the wheelchair's not going to stay upright. But then there's a whole ass stone staircase that we have never seen in the entire movie that's just there. It's like 100 steps, and he goes down all of those. And I was like, it makes Mac and Me, if you've seen Mac and Me, where the little boy, like, goes down the world's widest hill and then falls off a cliff in his wheelchair and survives, it makes that look excessive. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot. So, you win some and you lose some.
I mean, as someone who has a disability, when you see that, are you like, are deaths in horror movies just a joke now? Like, are we a joke, or do you?
It's
Or
interesting. It depends on the movie. When to go back to Something About Mary, when I saw that in the theater, Mind you, I was at an age I should not have seen the movie, but my mom, was like, movies aren't real, so I'll take you to go see most anything. But I thought it was hilarious watching, the character of Tucker do all these crazy contortions. It was so over the top. And people behind, in the audience were horrified that I was laughing. I was not, as a disabled person, I was not supposed to find that funny. And then when you find out that the character, it's all a hoax, I was like, yeah, that's the point. With horror, it really depends on context. It really depends on context. So like in a movie like that, I'm like, it's a slasher movie. They're horny teens. Like, he's actually on an equal footing with everybody because he is one of many teens. They're all going to end up in this. He's not a girl, so he's not going to be the final girl. I have no expectation that he's going to live, and I think the fact too that most of these movies don't follow the belief. There is this belief that disabled people die first. Well, they're the weakest. Well, if you watch some of these movies, Mark does not die first. He dies like somewhere in the middle, the grand scheme of things. Franklin actually is one of the second, I think he's the last person to die in Texas Chainsaw. And he's also the only one to get the actual chainsaw. Everybody else dies differently. So for me, I'm like, actually, horror puts these characters on the same playing field where they're all cannon fodder, all of them. And, I'm like, in some instances, I'm like, would I want them to live just because they're disabled? That doesn't sound right either. Like, they shouldn't be spared just because they're disabled any more than should they be spared because they're, a person of color or because they're, a woman or so for me, the horror genre really does put everybody on the same, gives them the same skills, the same tools, and says, "Good luck."
Great point. I mean, maybe the horror genre is more inclusive to the disabled community than the other genres.
It is. It is. Oh, 100%.
And maybe more kinder too, because you said everyone's on a even playing field. If it's a drama, everyone's going through the struggle and everyone has to feel sympathy.
If it's a drama, it's usually about disability, 1, and it's usually the story of an abled person trying to navigate a disabled person's life, so the disabled person is always ancillary to their own story, in most disabled dramas, whereas horror is just like, here's a bunch of teens. One of them has like, they're doing exactly what I wish more movies were doing. You're telling a story, and it just happens to have a disabled person in it. That's it.
And you're not like, we're not making everything about this.
Yes, yeah,
It's just like these are people living in a world with other people doing normal things,
yeah,
and that's it. And most I think that's the hardest part about movies is they're like, "We have to tell this big grand story." Like, you can just go out and there will be you will see you're going to bump into a disabled person in your
yeah,
life more than once. It doesn't matter when you go out and you see they buy groceries. They go to
yeah,
the bank. Like,
yep.
I don't know why Hollywood is still so stuck on the struggle and the
Yeah.
journey, and I feel like I mean, I'm able-bodied, and even I'm like, I've seen them shopping, like, I don't think they're they're all struggling like I
No,
mean,
no. I mean, it's funny. I was at a movie, weirdly enough. I was waiting in line at a movie theater, and there was an older woman who was looking at me, and she sparks up a conversation, and she's like, you know I've been in a wheelchair before, and I understand how it is, and I hope that whatever you have isn't permanent and you'll be out of the chair soon. And it didn't break my heart, but I felt like I had to really pop her bubble and be like, "Well, I've been in this wheelchair my entire life. It's not gonna go away. So, it is what it is." But I'm like, "But I appreciate, you talking to me." And she couldn't let it go. She was like, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I brought it up." And I was like, and then I couldn't let it go. I'm like, "Why are you sorry? Why are you sorry?" And I was like, "Are you sorry because you think that my life is sad?" and she didn't really have a good answer, and she really didn't wanna continue the conversation, but I was like I'm like, "This is what movies sell," this is what they believe make people believe, which is that, my life is sad and, that if you remind me about how disabled I am, it's gonna depress me, and I'm like, "No, dude, like, trust me, I get depressed, but it's not about my disability is on, like, the bottom of things I could get depressed about this year alone." Like, right now, I'm just kind of like, you know, state of the free world, free speech, economy, getting a job, those are, like, all the things. Disability actually is not even a concern I have right now.
Yeah, we I guess we just project these certain images that we have of people. Like, I mean, gosh, we're terribly bad to project, African Americans as being these poor people. That's like, no, like not every black person is poor and is a criminal. Like,
Yeah,
it's just we're so bad at like we have these certain stereotypes and it doesn't matter if it's a religious community, a racial community, any of that. And it's just not the case for any of
yeah.
it, but, the movies, I'm telling you, that would we
Necessary evil,
yes, you
necessary
you
evil.
love it, but then sometimes you're like, "That's just not how it is."
Exactly.
So, do films like Soul Surfer and Wonder and other inspirational or moving films about disability, do they make you feel angry, or are you like, "You could do better,"
Oh,
or
you could definitely do better. In those are movies I call inspiration porn, which is, you watch the story of this character, that has some sort of, horrific event happen to them, or they're born with this horrific, and it's always horrific disability, and you watch them go through the shame and the bullying and the horrors of having to live in this world. You're not confronting the community that does this. You're looking at it as like, how does this poor child survive this cavalcade of horrors? And then they come out the other side because they're just so innocent and pure and kind. And so when I watch those, I'm just kind of like, oh, so you want disabled people to be, disabled people live in film in a perpetual state of gratitude. We have to be grateful for everything. We have to be grateful if a guy harassing us is interested in us. We have to be grateful. We have to be grateful that the government gives us a pittance of, financial aid. Mind you, they're also dictating whether we can get married and own a car and own a house and all these other things. We need to be grateful that people want to tell our stories, even if it's about, it's beautiful little Jacob Tremblay character who's swathed in prosthetics, being made fun of for 2 hours and watching his kind-hearted mother, who is actually the real star of the movie, advocate for him. So most every character in a disabled movie of a certain stripe has to express gratitude. And if they are not expressing enough gratitude, then usually there is a plot point where the able person has to be like, "You are a horrible person and you need to be more grateful." Case in point, I always talk about The Upside, which is the American remake of the Intouchables with Bryan Cranston and Kevin Hart. And there's a part where, Bryan Cranston's character is independently wealthy, which is another stereotype that we see a lot. Most disabled people on screen have a lot of money, even though we know that that's not true. But he's a character that is just like constantly bitter and upset about everything, even though he's got like more money than God and a house that's built for him and all this stuff. And at a certain point, there's a birthday party for him that he's not happy that like somebody else did. Which I watched this movie and I'm like, what he's saying is he doesn't have control over his own life. And he would like some control over his own life. But Kevin Hart's character comes in and starts telling him about what an ungrateful jerk he is, and then starts smashing all his shit, and is like, the whole point is Bryan Cranston's character is able to finally purge all this anger because Kevin Hart is breaking all of his valuables. And I think that is my my big issue is that able people, we see it with people of color. If you look at movies about people of color historically, they often present the world as filled with benevolent white people that want to help them, and all it does is undermine this belief that black people actually have problems, because the movie's saying, "Actually, that's not true. There are good people out there. You're just not seeing them." Disabled movies do the same thing, which is saying that, like, you don't actually have real problems. Like, there are people that want to take care of you and help you. And the point of most of these movies is, like, we don't wanna be taken care of. We don't want to have to we want control of our own lives. We want autonomy. And I don't see anything beneficial about having somebody come in and tell me that I should be grateful and then proceed to, like, destroy my stuff as some type of trust exercise.
Yeah. It's it shouldn't be that way. And
Yeah,
speaking of caretakers, I also have another question. You think that caretakers are positively represented well in the movies? You talk about the miracle worker and the other side of the mountain. You heavily critique those. You say Bo Bridges' character's the worst, and
he
that
is so bad. He is so bad.
and
Um No, I mean, I think, yeah, it's all of it. Caregivers also get a really, really weird position in film, because often they're the star of the movie. They're the able-bodied buffer that the movie is actually really about. So you watch how, they are changed for good, by interacting with a disabled person. So, like, Breathe, or Theory of Everything, often the female characters on the same level, if not the de facto star, Me Before You. And often caregivers, it's a totally different movie depending if the caregiver is male or female. So if you get a male caregiver, it's usually more of a buddy film, something like Kevin Hart's character in The Upside, where, a lot of the humor is like, "Oh my god, I have to help this guy with a catheter. Does that make me gay?" Like, there's a lot of just, like, weird gay panic and, like, he's the wingman, that's what he is. When it comes to women who are caregivers, they're either always mothers or they are wives. And if they're not either of those, they're still a sex worker in some way. The weirdness of making caregivers sex workers in these movies is disturbing. And I understand part of it. The first caregiver disabled people have is their mother. But most of the time that extends to most of the paramours in these movies become their mothers. And that's again limiting disabled dating options in these movies, which is like, well, I want somebody that's going to take care of me and be my mother mommy, and
yeah,
it's
and then
very disturbing.
you get into some
Um,
weird territory out there.
Yes, something like I love John Hawkes in The Sessions, but I mean, Helen Hunt's character is quite literally a therapist who is a sex therapist that has sex with, disabled people. So that happens a lot, and I think that that's really limiting and puts caregivers in uncomfortable positions and disabled people in uncomfortable positions. Mary Bronstein, when she did If I Had Legs I'd Kick You, which is out right now, her and I was fortunate to talk to her about how she looked at the movie as a disabled story. And she said, she would never seek to tell a disabled story because that's not her place. But she was like, as a person who has been a caregiver for a chronically ill child, she's like, I can tell that story. And I think what people are really struck and in some cases turned off by is that Rose Byrne's character is not the prototypical mother caregiver. She's flawed. She's butting up against her own individual desires and the things she wants to do and having to care for a child that is disabled. And people are not sure how to handle that, because they're supposed to see disabled caregivers as perpetually suffering women who have to sublimate their own dreams, damn it, to care for a disabled person. Now, mind you, men, in something like The Other Side of the Mountain, you know, Bo Bridges' character doesn't sublimate anything for his own dreams. He's still flying planes and being a raconteur daredevil. Like he doesn't give up anything for the Marilyn Hassett character in that movie. If anything, he is what you see a lot in caregiver movies with that are romantic, where the man, it's an interabled relationship with a disabled woman, is I would call control masquerading as care, so the fact that Beau Bridges' character picks her up like a sack of potatoes, puts her in the middle of the street, and they're gonna have an argument as cars go around them. She's sitting there struggling to eat, and he looks at, and I talk about it in the book. He looks at her parents, and she's like, "Can you help me cut my food?" And he looks at her, and he's like, "No." And he looks at her parents and says, "We wouldn't want to spoil her now, would we?" And I'm like, "Dude, I'm pretty sure there is a world of difference between assisting somebody in eating and, I
Spoiling
don't
them. Yeah.
yeah, giving them $1 billion. I don't know. Robbie Benson in something like Ice Castles, where he's just like yelling at the poor blind girl, like, "You can do a triple axel, and I don't know why you can't. You're just lazy." So it doesn't make caregivers look good either. It puts them in really awkward positions where they believe like, is this disabled person gonna fall in love with me? Do I have to be a sex worker? Like, do I have to be their mom? Like, that's not what we want. That's not what we want. I mean, maybe there's some people that want that. I don't know, but I would say the majority of disabled people do not want that.
Yeah. I mean, I f like you said, caregivers need as much accurate representation as disabled community because
Yeah,
some people can live independently and some cannot. And
yeah.
I think it's important to tell those who cannot and their caregiver story just as accurately as you do those who live independently. Do you think The Sessions is better than The Other Side of the Mountain and The
It's
Miracle
weird.
Worker?
You
Or
know,
are you like, "Eh"?
It's weird because I do think that, there's a lot I appreciate about The Sessions, which is, it's about a guy who wants to be sexual. He's not he has guilt about wanting to be sexual, not because he's disabled, but because he's a devout Catholic. I love that Helen Hunt's character emphasizes that she is a therapist first and foremost, but then the movie falls into stereotype towards the end where she starts to wonder if she's having feelings for him. Like, I'm like, "Why out of all of the other people you've done this with are you having feelings? Why is there transference? I don't understand." And at the end of the movie, even though it is based on real events, the real Mark O'Brien character did end up marrying, one of his doctors, one of his nurses. So, I do think that for all of the good it does, and this is most disabled movies, not every no disabled movie is perfect, and we compartmentalize a lot. So for me, I'm like, The Sessions is 80% a great movie, and then there's that other 20 that's still not great.
I watched it and I was thinking, "Oh, I thought it was good up until, Helen Hunt catching feelings," and I'm like
Yeah,
I was just like and her husband was super controlling, and I'm just like, "I don't like any of this part." Like, I
yeah.
could do without it. I think we'd be good, but, it I didn't write the movie, so I can't. I mean,
Sure. I
I'm
mean,
pretty sure I was a child at that time, so
and I mean, keep in mind, most screenwriters deliberately pick true stories. And my argument is I think they pick true stories to get around issues like this, criticism. They say, "Well, it was based on real things. This has really happened to people. You can't critique it because this is real." And that's not true. Song Sung Blue, I get that a lot from people when they read my review. They're like, "It really happened. She really did lose a leg." And I was like, "Yes, but can you guarantee that she was having some sort of weird lucid dream where she's out on her front lawn singing Patsy Cline?" Like, I don't know. Come on, you're telling me that there's not any point of this movie that is fantasizing certain things? But that's, screenwriters do that deliberately. So
yeah. Hey, were there any
I,
performance oh, sorry, continue.
I was gonna say I do have to wrap it up in a few minutes. So
Okay, good, because 'cause we're about to reach rapid fire and we'll be done. Okay.
yeah.
Were there any performances from 2025 that positively represented the disability community?
I mean, there's only one major movie that had a significant disabled character in it, and that's Marissa Bodie in Wicked for Good. And I wrote an article for Variety about this. People can read it. And I think that the movie did about as good as it could fixing, quote unquote, kind of the more ableist elements of the play. It did as much as it could. So, I love that we kind of tried to give her more redemption. At the same time, she's still I love that we eliminated the whole, like, the shoes make her walk thing, which was usually the big problem. But, we still have her turning into this controlling dictator, and she still, ends up dying and kind of being swept under the rug or the house, quite literally. So, it was never gonna be perfect, but I do think that having somebody like Marissa Bodie in that role was great. And my question is the same thing that I ask of Troy Kotsur. Who's gonna put Marissa Bodie in a movie next? And is it gonna be about disability, or is it just gonna be her being a character?
Great point. I was going to ask you what performances from 2025 that negatively represented the disabled community, and I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to
I would
say.
say there's also only one really major movie that's done that, and that is, yeah, Song Sung Blue.
Yeah, you've discussed it. So, what are your hopes for disability representation in the future?
So much. I would love for there to be more than one film that I can pull from. I don't know if that's gonna happen. We need greenlighting more disabled stories, yes, but we also just need to create more opportunities for disabled actors and disabled screenwriters and disabled directors. I wanna see more disabled people at all levels, whether that's cinematography, costume design, all of that. We need more disabled people in the C-suites, greenlighting some of these things. um, we need more disabled sex, and interabled relationships and disabled relationships, neither one of which should be exclusive. We should not only see disabled people dating disabled people, nor should we only see them only dating able people. We should be able to see all of it. More disabled women in movies, more disabled teen girls, more disabled people of color, less focus on, people being aesthetically pleasing or able to pass for abled. So hiring disabled people that maybe, have, spina bifida or my disability, osteogenesis imperfecta, or other things. So variety of things I'd love to see.
I agree. Okay, rapid fire. You ready?
Sure.
Favorite movie?
Disabled movie or just favorite movie in general?
Movie in general.
Oh gosh. Meet Me in St. Louis.
A famous movie you've never seen.
Godfather 2.
Favorite movie snack.
M&M's.
Favorite movie beverage.
I'm any type of soda.
Your favorite movie trope.
Oh gosh, so tough. It's a really niche one. I love movies where people all have babies on the same day. I don't know why that's a trope. Like, usually it was a real big thing in the 90s. You would often see movies where, like, the main character's pregnant and they'd show up and they're like, something's going on. Every woman's gone into labor right this second. Yeah. So I love that. We need to bring that back.
Least favorite movie trope.
I mean, pretty much everything I've talked about for the last the last hour, anything ableist.
I agree. What movie makes you laugh?
Oh gosh. I mean, I was just watching Step Brothers the other day, and that movie still will get me. That or a Jackass movie, any of them.
Step Brothers was great. What movie makes you cry?
Oh, I mean, the first 15 minutes of Up.
That's very classic. I witnessed many women crying my first screening of that when I was like 6.
Yeah, it's like, "How dare you, Disney, make me sob and focus on mortality in the first, like, 10 minutes of this movie."
If you could slap a movie character that annoys you, who would you slap and why?
Oh god. There's so many characters. So many. I talk a lot about Melissa Leo and The Fighter, probably. David O. Russell women really annoy me because they're usually always like shrews and harpies. So yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind.
Oh, great. Okay, favorite movie hero?
Ooh. I mean, I mean, Sebastian Stan is perfect, so Bucky Barnes, and you could argue Bucky is also a disabled character because he doesn't have, an arm, and you don't see him crying like Jesse Biel
Yes,
over, so go
I
figure.
agree. Yeah. And then your favorite movie villain.
Oh, wow. Um, so many villains. I'm gonna be unoriginal. Alan Rickman in the first Die Hard.
Well, that was the end of our rapid fire. Kristen, thank you so much. Your book is incredible. Everybody, buy Popcorn Disabilities. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Anytime.
Have a great day. Do what you need to do, and I'll probably talk to you later sometime.
Yes. We'll talk soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.
That was a fantastic conversation with Kristen Lopez. I enjoyed having her on the pod. Hope she comes back soon. I gained so much more insight on the disabled community and disability representation in the media, and there's so much that we can do to better that. That being said, please buy her book, Popcorn Disabilities. You can get it wherever you buy books. You can get this podcast wherever you have podcasts except for Apple because for some reason they don't like me there. Also, next week, Paul Thomas Anderson episode with some great guests, some returners, and some new ones. There will be audio issues because of the past program I used. And if you have a problem with that, then don't listen to it. But if you can get past the audio issues, then go ahead. There will also be a Billy Wilder Hall of Fame episode coming at the end of this month. And then in March, we will have Oscar nominations, post-Oscar show, and 2 drafts. So please feel free to stick around and listen to those as well. Thanks for listening to the pod, and I hope to see you soon.